We're going to have so much to talk about that maybe getting started a few minutes early is not a bad idea. I am so thrilled to start the new year with Ford. Some of you may have already read this book. Some of you may have followed it on Facebook. There will be copies for sale, and Ford is donating the proceeds to the church. So if you want a copy, and you will, they'll be available. I was just saying to Ford that we're so proud of our parish authors, and we love to lift them up. But why are we doing this? Why are we talking about this particular book today? And I'm just going to read straight from the book and tell you. Stories bind us together. They teach us, they entertain us, they reveal who we are, or at least who we want to be. They demonstrate our values, our love for family and country, our empathy for strangers, our desire to form new connections, our concern for equality and justice. Stories help us remember, and the stories that are only partly told or sometimes not told at all can cause us to forget or to never know things that are or should be important to us. We are rooted in stories. We are rooted in storytelling, and Ford is going to talk to us about just that. If you've got a mic, right?
I think I do.
If you want to start by reading or telling us how this journey began, I'll let you do that.
Well, how about that? Yeah. Okay, good. I am so delighted to see all of my friends here. It gives me a lot of joy to talk about this book and this story, but even more so amongst so many of you who I know. Maybe a good place to start is to pick up on what you just said, Boykin. A lot of people who read this story, which was originally posted in a serialized manner on Facebook over many months in the summer of 2024, considered it sort of a fun, amusing lark, an enjoyable way to entertain my father, who was nearing 100. And I concluded what I thought was the end of the story on his 100th birthday with this paragraph. And this follows exactly what you read. These are big, weighty words: love, family, selfless service. And I understand that some of you will skirt past them, and that's okay. But for me, this story, a gift to my father, but also a gift from him to me, is more than a summertime amusement. It has been my way of thanking him for all his stories that first shaped him and then me. And now I am blessed to share his stories and his storytelling with my own family and with you. Thanks, Dad, and happy 100th.
So maybe we should back up and just let people know what story you started out telling. So your dad was a well-known storyteller. He sounds like he engaged people in stories all the time, but there was one that you had not heard him tell before, and he dropped some clues that you wanted to pick up.
So I spent a lot of time with my father, particularly in the last, say, 8 or 9 years of his life. He lived in Raleigh with my mother. They lived in Raleigh for over 60 years. My mother died 4 years ago, in 2021, four years ago. And especially in the last 4 years, I spent a great deal of time with him. I would spend, without fail, like clockwork, every Monday from roughly 4 o'clock all the way to 11, sometimes midnight. I would drive to Raleigh and spend time with him. And we would talk. It was a time when neither of us was particularly rushed. We were truly able just to savor, this relationship, this togetherness. And one evening, he told me a story, as he did almost every time I visited him. And most of the stories I had heard many, many times, so much so that I could tell many of them by heart. But this story I had never heard. And this story took place in November of 1945. at that time 79 years ago. And he told me that as he came back from the war, he had been a Navy ensign serving on an oil tanker in the Pacific. He came through the port of San Francisco. He was given a very brief home leave to eastern North Carolina. Servicemen, the war had just ended, servicemen and women were pouring into San Francisco. There were no trains, no planes, no way to really get out. But a shipmate of his, fiance, worked for United Airlines. And she said, Ford, his name was also Ford, go to the airport and I will pull some strings and I will just get you started on this trip home. So he went to the airport, he stayed there all day, and eventually one of the airline employees approached him and introduced him to a woman. And my father, an important fact, was dressed in his Navy dress uniform. He looked pretty dapper. In fact, he's maybe up there if you want to advance the slide. Advance it a couple of times if you can. Anyway, he looked pretty dashing. He was in his Navy dress uniform. And this woman, who was en route from San Francisco to Omaha, volunteered to give up her seat to him, which was a big deal. Flying from the West Coast to the East Coast at that time was like buying half of a car. And my dad, was delighted to have the offer. He considered it a patriotic gesture of appreciation. He had just returned from the war. He had been protecting this woman and all Americans for years. And so he said he'd love to take her up on it, but there was a catch. And the catch was that he had to be responsible for getting her 10-year-old boy, who was traveling with her, safely to her mother, the boy's grandmother, who would be meeting them late that night in Omaha. And my dad said, sure, we've got a deal. And he gets on the plane. The boy's name was Chester, as he recalled. He gets on the plane. They stop. The first stop is in Las Vegas. The boy, by this point, is already calling my father Daddy. And my dad gets off, he said, to get a drink at the bar. What have I gotten myself into, he was thinking. And then they get to Omaha late at night, and no one is there to meet Chester, to claim Chester. And so my dad really said he agonized about what to do. Should I turn this boy over to the police? Should I give him to the airline? Should I take him with me? And when he told me this story, again, this was June of 2024, when he told me this story and he told me that he had asked himself, should I take him with me? I said, Dad, you've got to be kidding. You didn't consider taking this boy with you. And he said, no, I had promised, I had committed to the boy's mother that I would be responsible for getting him safely to the boy's grandmother. And I had decided that I was indeed going to take him with me. And about just as they were boarding, in fact, just minutes before they were boarding the next flight, which was a military flight, the boy's grandmother showed up. And I, on a lark, just a pure whim, decided right then and there, and I told him, because it was clear that he had wondered about this boy. In fact, he told me that as he traveled during his business career to San Francisco, he had always made a point of checking phone books and city directories because he thought he knew the boy's full name, Chester Park. I told my father that I was not only going to find out or locate this boy, who at that point would be 91 years old, but I was going to report back and tell him what became of the boy. And so I dived in, and coming out of the venture capital industry, which is where my career was spent, I knew about crowdsourcing, and I thought, well, this will be a fantastic, just an ideal situation to use the Facebook crowd. And I'll post something, leads will pour in, I'll sift through them, and I'll either find the boy quickly and maybe have a nice celebratory post a week or two later, or, and I actually thought this was far more likely, nothing will come of it, it will peter out, and that will be the end of it. And so that launched this story, which then unfolded for months.
This very brief encounter becomes this bigger story. And, you know, I know times have changed, but I don't even watch somebody's bag when they go to the bathroom, right? I mean, if you're at an airport and somebody said, watch my purse, you'd be like, I can't do that. The idea of taking somebody's child across the country is just wild. But you said that it exemplified something about your dad that just rang so true. And I'll let you tell me which slide now that I know how to work it. Do you want to?
That's him. He's to the left. This is what he looked like when he landed in San Francisco, and he immediately went to the barber shop and became the image on your right. And this was what he looked like when he met Chester and Chester's mother.
But you, sorry to interrupt my other question before you could even answer, but you said, yeah, this story, there's something about it that just speaks to the qualities of my dad.
Well, one of the interesting things, well, let me back up and say, I never sat down to write a book. I never mapped out even a story. I had no idea how this was going to unfold. And so I posted on Facebook. I got all these leads did come in, and in the meantime, I dived into just his voluminous archives, his archival records from that period. One thing that may interest you is that in his archives were 600 letters that were written either from him to his parents or from his parents to him. 600 letters. That was an average of about 3 every day that they wrote. A completely different period. And as these posts, this story was unfolding, I was able to sort of look back and appreciate, how different those times really were in so many ways, including, as you mentioned, the idea that people regularly and normally traveled by hitchhiking. That was a very common way of getting around. And there was a sense, I think, a community sense, as at least as my dad recalls, of responsibility for other people. Now, I don't know that it was that common for mothers to hand over their young children to Navy officers for trips to Omaha, but it was a whole different time. And repeatedly, as this story unfolded, I was reminded of just how different, things were at that point.
Well, you also bring up an idea of trust, and you decided to take a private story public. You trusted strangers with this story, and then I'm going to tell you, if you haven't read this book, it is a real page turner. You keep following clues and meeting new people along the way. How did you get these people to trust you? You were cold calling people and asking them to share their own private stories. How did you establish trust?
Well, Boykin, I made so many mistakes. If I could do this whole thing again, there's so many different things I would do differently. But the one thing that I did right, and I think this was subconscious because I didn't know how this was going to unfold, but subconsciously I laid the groundwork as I went for people to trust me. And I wasn't really doing this intentionally, but it did happen. And again, with the benefit of reflection, I can go back and I can say, I emphasize transparency and credibility. I completely opened up my Facebook to the world. In communicating with people, I would give my phone number, my email address. I would tell them things that were intended to share parts of myself, information about myself that would, I think, enhance the likelihood that they would trust me. And then as I got to the point, after having spent, weeks and weeks of primarily sifting through the data, the census and countless other documentary records, as I eventually got to the point where I began interacting with people, I practiced patience, was an important way of building trust. I never pushed anyone to get back to me. I was, even though I was sort of, at a certain point, I felt like I was on a deadline because I wanted, if possible, to bring this to a close for my dad's 100th birthday. But I tried to be patient. Where there were opportunities to build credibility, I look for them. For instance, I don't know if Elizabeth Marie is here, but I remember calling her at one point because I had discovered that one particular possible Chester's niece is an Episcopal priest in Knoxville, Tennessee. And I thought, well, if I reach out to this person, they can look me up on the web in lots of different ways. They might, in fact, make a connection to Chapel Hill, and then maybe they'll make a connection to my involvement with the Chapel of the Cross. And so, and if they're an Episcopal priest, they might call Elizabeth Marie. So I gave her a heads up in terms of what I was doing. As I got deeper and deeper involved in the pursuit of one particular Chester, I began contacting members of his family. I made a point to let them know that I would not disclose or publish information to which they objected. I had no interest in intruding or embarrassing or harming anyone. That was the farthest thing from my mind. But that also engendered trust. And so, without that, and again, I did it very subconsciously, without that, I would never have been able to get, to the end of this interesting story.
There's going to be a time for Q&A, and I know you're going to ask, like, what happens in the end. We're not going to tell you. But I will say that, you followed some paths that didn't take you where you hoped they would. And yet you still built these relationships and friendships with people who seem truly grateful for the opportunity to tell their story to you and to have somebody listen.
One of the most important junctures in this story came after I had exchanged, it was really almost an exhilarating exchange of emails with a particular person. She was on the West Coast. She was the daughter of A. Chester Park from Kansas, and for a brief period, we both felt like we had converged on the Chester Park, my dad's Chester Park. It was, quite exhilarating. And then I discovered a letter in my father's archives that included some clues that ruled out her father. And so we were both disappointed. But that juncture, again, as I look back, at how this story unfolded, was arguably one of the most important junctures, because up to that point, I had understood this as a detective tale. I was doing an investigation. I was using my background as a former journalist and a lawyer to find someone, deep in the weeds, so to speak. And that's how I understood the story. But this particular person, this Chester Park's daughter, whose name was Linda Yazdani, again, in email, she recognized something that I hadn't fully appreciated. She had been reading my post on Facebook carefully, and she saw that this was a story, not just a detective tale, although it was that, but she saw that it was a story about memory and connection and family. She also saw that it was a story, frankly, about data and privacy and trust. And ultimately, it was a story about a son's relationship with his father. And, all of these notions were in my mind, but I hadn't really conceived of the story that I was telling as involving all of these different layers. And so after I had this exchange with Linda Yazdani, I made a conscious decision to pause, to really pause, and as I saw opportunities to pursue or to weave some of these interesting aspects of the larger story, I did so.
Well, asking the right questions and listening with true curiosity and respect to the answers is so important. And I would love for you to tell that story about your dad and Alexander and the way he did that when Alexander was working at the grocery store. Is that one you would share? Because I was like, oh, here's where Ford gets this talent. It is listening and encouraging other people to tell their own stories.
I would love to, and this is a good passage maybe to read. Of all the ways he connected with people, storytelling was his favorite. With the right story, he could reach across life's invisible divides, helping others feel seen and understood. Many years ago, my son was going through a rough patch. He was working in the produce department of a grocery store, not where he had expected to be at that point in his life. Granddaddy wrote him a carefully crafted letter describing his own involvement with fruits and vegetables, 10 of them in all, beginning with the artichokes he stole from a neighbor when he was 5, and ending with the crop of corn he planted in a poorly conceived partnership with his brother-in-law at age 24. There was a personal moral, a life lesson associated with each of the plums, pears, sweet potatoes, cucumbers, and so on that he wrote about. For example, his discovery of a wild strawberry patch when he was 6 taught him that the small, knobby fruit he found in the field was often as sweet or even sweeter than the large, glossy, perfectly formed specimens sold in the grocery store. My father's colorful stories, leavened with nostalgia and often a touch of mischief, drew you in. And by the time he got to the big picture advice, again, this was a letter that he was sending my son, his grandson. By the time he got to the big picture advice, you were engaged, curious, and perhaps ready to absorb a life lesson. And my father read parts of this letter at my father's funeral some months later, and he read this part. It was quintessential Granddaddy, he said, turning a simple job into an opportunity for growth and a lesson in observation, ownership, and lifelong learning. And it was very clear as Alexander read that letter at my father's funeral service, which drew hundreds and hundreds of people, that Alexander had absorbed the life lessons.
And when you jumped from Facebook to the book, I know that you really wanted to take the lessons from your dad and the empathy that he showed people and put it on the printed page. And I feel like you did that so well.
Well, you know, I brought this story, I thought I had brought this story to a nice, neat end exactly on my dad's 100th birthday. That was when the last post went up, or at least what I thought was the last post. And then my father died about 7 weeks later. Unexpectedly, he was in superb physical and mental health. And I absorbed the idea of living without him for a number of months. He's always with me, of course. He's right here with us. And then it occurred to me that this story, which I had thought was so neatly finished, was not finished at all. I had told a story about what became of the boy named Chester, or at least I thought I had, but I hadn't told enough of the story of what became of the young sailor. And so I wrote a substantial additional number of chapters to sort of flesh that out.
Will you take us through some of the pictures on the slideshow? Well, so it's not intuitive, but you use the bottom arrow.
Oh, the bottom.
And we can.
Well, so my dad, his backstory was he grew up in eastern North Carolina in Washington. He lived there until 1947. He joined the Navy at age 18. His parents were terrified of him joining the Navy, but all of his friends, of course, were doing that, and so he joined the moment he could. He served he went to school here in the V-12 program, and then was posted to the Pacific in 1944. And this particular slide, which I use sometimes in presentations, is really about me, because, again, when I made the decision to pause and sort of go off on some of these interesting tangents, one of the tangents was me. I had been in my early career a journalist at Fortune. This is something they call the editor's desk, which was about a story I had written, which was nominated for a National Magazine Award in 1987. I added these kinds of stories, but I always kept them very close to the main sort of narrative. And the way that this came into play, my experience at Fortune, is that it was at Fortune where I learned to be a researcher. I learned what it meant to exhaustively check, and source particular facts. And I included that anecdote in the story at a point where I was beginning to think that maybe I had possibly found Chester, but it was not by the standards of my mentor at Fortune, Mary Johnston. This is the postcard that my dad sent his sister the very day that he returned to San Francisco, and he told a wonderful story about sailing beneath the Golden Gate Bridge. You can't really see it in this image, but he sort of has doctored the ship that is far to the far right as it passes under the span. He's doctored it to draw the outline of his oil tanker, the USS Lackawanna. And he told me about, sailing under the bridge. Every sailor, every crew member on the ship was up on the deck. A long, banner was trailing, hundreds of feet long, 1 foot for every member of the crew, and they were singing, "San Francisco, open your golden gate." So just a wonderful kind of memory. This is the letter that I alluded to just a few minutes ago, that kind of derailed the idea that Linda Yazdani's Chester Park was in fact my father's Chester Park, because we discovered in this letter that my dad had written to his shipmate's fiancée that the boy's mother was divorced. And that was an important additional clue that I was able to use as I sifted through all of these different data sources, hundreds of newspapers, the U.S. Census, immigration records, you name it. This is the detour, my Fortune magazine detour, where among many other things that occurred that were pretty important, I met Allison. These are the clues that I was working with as I sifted through the data sources. I knew the boy's first name. My dad was pretty sure, but not completely sure, that he knew the boy's last name. The boy's age, he reckoned that he was around 10. The boy's mother, he reckoned that she was around 30. I expanded those age ranges as I sifted through census and other data. And then my father also knew, as he recorded in this letter, that the boy's mother was divorced. We also knew that the grandmother had met the boy at the Omaha airport, and then we knew a few other things that I was able to use as a researcher. I consulted, so many different experts to help me understand what had really happened at the San Francisco airport, particularly people who make a living analyzing written records. And in this case, the letter was being analyzed by, this is a UNC linguistics professor. I had several linguistics professors who helped me sort of parse through my dad's awkward syntax to really help me understand one relationship that I was curious about in particular, which is, did the boy's mother work for United Airlines? We spent a lot of time trying to analyze the sentence structure and the way that my dad had described the relationships to get at that. And that was important because if I could determine that the boy's mother did in fact work for United Airlines, that would give me another criterion or parameter against which I could check out the people who became candidates for the person I was looking for. I also did a very crude estimate of what are the odds that any random person might be my father's Chester, and it comes out to be about 1 out of 140 million people, which was not, maybe coincidentally, the population of the United States at that time. So based on what I knew, 1 out of 140 million people. And this is the part that I just alluded to, that after my father died, I realized I really need to tell a lot more about him. And including one of his practices, which was to record so many details that were relevant to his life and what he called his portable memory. And actually, I've got one here. You can hold it up, Boykin. I inherited some of the portable memories. These were small notepads, notebooks. He carried these in his shirt pocket always. He was never without his portable memory. And he started keeping portable memories back in his 20s, and he maintained that practice all through his life. He eventually did transition to the iPhone, but this was sort of a precursor, I think, of the ways that many of us use our iPhone. He would keep in these portable memories not only names, addresses, telephone numbers, ultimately email addresses, but he would include things like his relationships, or when he had last seen people, or the part number for his engine on his boat, or the tenants at a building that he owned, or directions to a particular place that he had trouble finding. His portable memory was an indispensable part of his very, very extraordinary memory. In fact, he was, without any doubt, he was what is known as a superager, people who have the memory in their 90s and older of individuals that are 30 or 40 years younger. And I was able to, again, explore these kinds of layers in the book.
One thing you say in the book is that ordinary moments can make for extraordinary stories, and everybody's ordinary and everybody's extraordinary. And it goes without saying that, Jesus taught with stories. Stories are what bring us together. And you pulled this particular thread, but there's so many other stories you could have told too. Like, your dad's a super ager, you're remarkable, your family's amazing, but we're each amazing in our own ways. And I suspect people will have questions about, how do you do this? Like, especially in this moment in time. I mean, since the pandemic, it's been harder and harder to connect with people, to respect people's own personal histories. How do you make it happen? You don't have to answer that, because I think it's not fair for me to ask all the questions. But when you finish with the slideshow, because, super ager indeed.
Well, I have to respond to that by commenting on Elizabeth Marie's sermon. I don't know if she's still here. She was. The knock at the door. As you were giving a wonderful sermon today, I thought immediately of, this was a moment 79, 80 years ago. It was such an inconsequential moment for my father, at least at that moment, that unlike his practice, he never wrote it down. He told me as we neared the end of this long odyssey, that he had never considered it a good story. And yet, when you look back, it has rippled all the way through the decades, and it has now become an important part of the way that his children and his grandchildren, and frankly people beyond in the generations, will come to know him. It really becomes a part of the way I think we understand his legacy. And so I thought that was just a beautiful connection for me this morning.
Thank you. Okay, are there other questions? Because I can keep going, but I'm imagining there are other questions here. What did you learn about yourself in writing this? I mean, you said there have been all these ripples, but what surprising thing did you learn about yourself in writing this story?
Well, again, I never sat down to write this story, but I had always envisioned at some point writing a story, writing a book, using the same kinds of skills that I exercised in this storytelling. And I think one of the things that I realized was that that I want to do it again, that I want to do something else. But maybe on a different note, one of the things I appreciated or learned about myself is that there is a lot of meaning, I think, that can come from sharing about yourself. And even though I've done a lot of things in my career and my life that have been sort of in the public sphere, essentially, I'm a pretty private person, and I think my family has been surprised by the degree to which I shared parts of myself and parts of my family. It was very much not in keeping with really who they understood. Allison is nodding. They understood me. But the rewards have been, really, really meaningful to me. I've been able to, again, preserve the memory, not only for myself of my father, but for future generations. And I've heard from hundreds and hundreds of people for whom this story has resonated, and for whom it has caused them to reflect on their own relationships and their own desires to record their own family stories. And so, I've learned a lot about myself, but those are the two things that come to mind.
I hadn't thought about this until right now, and then I'll come back to Ted. Sometimes a story feels like a performance. You're the actor, you're telling the story, and that vulnerability you're mentioning, this was more of a conversation. I mean, this was an open story that other people could join. It was not a solo performance, and that strikes me as really important.
That's the right word, vulnerability. I knew Boykin would come up with the right word.
It's a hip word right now.
Even though it was not my nature to project myself with vulnerability, there was great reward in doing so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Ted.
Thank you. Had a little bit of a cold, but I'm not contagious anymore, supposedly. For one of the elements of this story that really interested me, it's a great detective story, great work of journalism, but also it's really a tribute to your dad. And in the end, you were able to complete your mission, I think, in that you arrived at an end before your dad passed. And I'm wondering, what sort of judgment did your father render to you about what you had done, you and he together had done?
Well, let me read something if I can find it real quickly.
As you look, I'll say, that question points to the fact that Ford was giving this gift to his dad, and then it turns out, again, that ripple effect, that it was a gift that was given to so many other people, even strangers, and I'm just filling the time while you look for the...
So, Ted, just to answer your question, I actually ended the story with this paragraph, and this is a number of months after he had died. He had seen, the final Facebook post, but he hadn't seen what came afterwards. And I was in his apartment, his condo in Raleigh, and I was alone, going through file cabinets and the like. And I found a file that he had kept, I hadn't been aware of this, that was labeled file number H266, Chester Search. My dad, by the way, was the son of a librarian and the husband of a librarian, and he was meticulously organized. And I write, inside this folder is a draft of several of the early chapters of our story and a clipping of the newspaper piece published the day after he turned 100. This was a piece that ran in the News and Observer. I remember reading that article to him that same evening. This is the day after he turned 100. The moment is etched in my mind. It is as fresh today as if it happened yesterday. My memory of that moment is another of his many gifts to me. After I finished reading the article to him, he smiled and gave me his final verdict. I never bothered to tell you the story, he said, because it never seemed to be that interesting. But you took a good story and made it into a great story. And, that was, you can imagine, how a son hearing that, would react. It was very meaningful. It was also meaningful to me because he was very skeptical that I had landed on the right Chester. He said, Ford, my Chester was Chester Park, whereas my Chester turned out to be Chester something else. However, as the story unfolded, I began hearing sort of through the grapevine from his friends that he had begun telling the story of our search. And also, and importantly, he had begun calling it our story. And he had become invested in it. And that again was another, really meaningful, sort of moment for a son to see, this collaboration evolve to the point where he believed that, I was really onto something.
Well, I don't have a question, but I would like to make a comment. I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and something that I took out of it was this correspondence, and it prompted me to go to the attic and find this treasure trove of letters from my mother to her mother and vice versa. I was born in 1943, and I have letters from 40 into the 60s that I had never really appreciated before, so I wanted to thank you for that. And I also applaud your father for the portable memory, because I immediately did that.
Well, having been born in 1943, this means that your your family's details, including you, are actually in a census that is publicly available, the 1950 census, which was first made available publicly in 2022. And in fact, if I had tried to find Chester anytime prior to 2012, which was when the 1940 census was first made publicly available, I couldn't have done it. There's something called the 72-year rule, and the government basically follows this rule to this day, that the personal information that is collected by the census every 10 years, of course, is not to be disclosed until 72 years after it has been taken.
I'm curious how you made the time. You're obviously a very accomplished, very busy man with a wife who is equally accomplished and busy. And I feel very inspired and would love to do something similarly. And I'm thinking, but I got to make dinner. I got to go to the basketball game. I've got the church supper people coming this week. So I'd just like to know how you went about the process.
I should let Allison answer that question. You know, I think the truth is I did become obsessed. I freely admit. But I also did this in the evening. Again, the lion's share of this research was conducted in databases, frankly, digital databases. And I was able to do that at all hours of the night. And so that's when I did most of the work. Once I got to the point where, I was really trying to understand why, like understanding who and where, which were really important and took an enormous amount of time, was one thing, but understanding why, what really happened. Did this woman turn her young son over to this young sailor, my dad was only 21, as an act of patriotism to honor him as he perceived it? Or, was something else in play? And understanding the why did involve communicating with people by email primarily, in some cases by phone. And I, of course, did the phone part during the day, but mostly it was done in the evening.
Well, we only have like 2 minutes left, so I'd like you to tell one more story because it is daunting. Like, who has a year to put together a book? That story of your dad when you're taking him out to brunch and you drop him at the restaurant and you go park the car and you come back and in 5 minutes he has done in miniature what you've done in this book in some ways. Will you tell that story and then we'll get you to sign books and talk to people?
Yeah, again, in the section of the book that I added after his death, I sort of weaved in a number of anecdotes, if you will, that were intended to sort of give his story a little bit more fuller flesh. And the one that you're referring to was when we were actually on a research mission to Washington, North Carolina, and I was sort of circling the block. We drove up to a restaurant on Main Street there, and I let him out. I parked the car. By the time I come into the restaurant, when I come into the restaurant, he's already seated at a table with two people, and has struck up a conversation. These are obviously two complete strangers, total strangers, just as Chester and Chester's mother were 80 years earlier. And after we sit down and we begin our lunch, the couple that he had been seated with and had struck up a conversation, they leave, and the waitress ultimately brings some cake and ice cream to our table, which we hadn't ordered, and we knew, of course, it had to be them. And although my dad thought it was me, and I sent an email immediately because the woman had left her card with my father. I sent her an email thanking her for this nice gesture. And she sent me back an email that was poignant, but it also just reinforced, one important part of who my father really was. And it shared some personal, personal poignant and almost devastating kind of personal history with him. But he was the type of person who somehow could instantly develop that kind of relationship, a trusting relationship, where someone he had never met before and had just spent a few minutes talking was willing and actually desired to share something very personal with him by way of thanking him for his kindness.
Thank you, and thank you for this wonderful conversation and the book. Again, if you would like a book, I think Allison is going to make some sales, and Ford is giving all the proceeds to the Chapel of the Cross.